Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the noon meeting. I think we'll start now. We probably will be joined by others, but it's my pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Sarah Birch, on the topic of climate change, mental health, and eco-anxiety implications for our society and the health sector. So just by way of introduction, Sarah holds a master's degree in conservation biology. She's a climate change professional with 15 years of progressive experience working on adapting to climate change. She has worked with the Western Cape department for the past 7 years as a key climate change adaptation expert, and is particularly interested in implications of climate change for human health and particularly mental health. She has trained as a resilience health coach to support individuals and empower people to embrace change and to reduce the overwhelming anxiety as the world changes. And in this presentation, she'll present her reflections on climate change and mental health and how professionals and allied health professionals can start including sensitive approaches to these eco-emotions as contributing factors to stress and overall health outcomes for individuals and communities. The presentation will probably be about half an hour, and after that we welcome any questions for discussion. The meeting is being recorded, and the recording will be shared with those who aren't able to make it. I convey apologies, particularly from Professor Andrea Rother, the head of the Division of Environmental Health. So welcome, Sarah, welcome everyone, and thank you again for presenting to us today.
Thanks, James. Thanks for the introduction. Just going to check my screen. Okay, so I should be in presentation mode. Hopefully that's all working. So thank you for having me present to the UC School of Public Health today. I really appreciate all of your time. I know that everybody has got a lot on their plates at the moment. James just invited me to talk a little bit about this nexus of climate change, mental health, that is becoming quite an important topic globally. So I'm just going to present a little bit on this today, but just a little bit to add on to James's introduction. Change professional, but I've also kind of diverged into the health space, and I'm a health coach. So basically that means I provide support to individuals in terms of creating behavioral change that they might need to make around different health aspects, whatever it is that they're dealing with. And through this work and obviously my climate change skills, I've moved into really focusing on mental health and mental health around responding to climate change, as it is becoming a very important space globally. And I myself have faced issues around mental health and eco-anxiety as a climate change professional, being faced with the information around the change in the world on a daily basis. So yeah, some of it's also from my own kind of personal dealings with the aspects of my own life. So just a little outline so you know where I'm going. I'm going to talk a little bit about the climate crisis, what it means in South Africa and the Western Cape, implications for our health in general. And I think some of you may be familiar with some of those aspects. And then start looking a little bit at the mental health crisis and what is eco-anxiety, and what is it that we're talking about, and what is it that people are doing about it. And I think maybe at the end we can maybe discuss a little bit about, what does this mean in a South African context? It is quite different here to other parts of the world. Okay, so Yeah, climate change. I am not sure how much all of the listeners know about climate change. I'm going to kind of presume a certain level of understanding, but what is important about climate change right now in this point in time in history is that we are actually now shifting into kind of a crisis mode. And I think many of you will have seen the Fridays for Futures kind of demonstrations that have been happening around the world prior to the pandemic hitting. A lot of students and youth really starting to raise their voices that not enough is being done internationally, and quite rightly so. Um, Internationally, we have about 9 years left to really turn the ship and make a significant impact in terms of responding to the climate change crisis and being able to actually manage it and handle it very well. So there's a lot of anxiety and angst, especially amongst younger generations. This slide might, seem a little insensitive at the moment, given where we're sitting with our current wave of COVID-19, but it is in fact the reality, and we know that we're in a crisis at the moment. But climate change is really going to kind of completely engulf and supersede what we're seeing at the moment in terms of economic and social and environmental disruption around the world. We've seen recently horrific cyclones in southern Africa. Mozambique was impacted a year or two back, with huge numbers of people displaced. Mozambique, Malawi, and I think Zimbabwe are three of the most impacted countries in the world that will be impacted by climate change. And those are our neighbors. So our neighboring countries also place an impact on South Africa in terms of migration and the impacts for our services as well in South Africa. We've seen, these images of fires in Australia just as the pandemic was starting, in California as well. Almost every year the fires in California are causing massive devastation, and it's entire neighborhoods, houses and structures and buildings and schools and medical facilities even that are being impacted by these fires. Even places like Nepal, which I would not expect to be kind of a very fire-prone type of place. It seems, very high up in the mountains, but they've also had severe fires just this past year as well. And even most recently, in the past few days, some of you may have seen the news about the heat waves in Canada. We all think of Canada as this cold, snowy country, which it is. They do have summers that can get warm, but what is happening there at the moment is completely unprecedented, and they are hitting all-time records in terms of high temperatures. And the heat waves there really are impacting people, in their physical health as well. And people are actually dying from the heat waves. So, these are all shocking images from around the world, but bringing it back home to where we are and specifically where we're all sitting at the moment, we've seen these kinds of fires ourselves in the garden route, in our informal settlements, even, although, some of them are obviously human induced, but the kinds of environment that we're setting up now with warming temperatures and prolonged heat waves and droughts just makes the fuel load and the space for fires to emerge much more likely. And the fires we saw at UCT just the other day, so it's really coming close to home, and these events, these actual events that are happening as well, are also triggers for trauma, which can also induce these mental health aspects around eco-anxiety as well. We also all remember the drought that we've had in the Western Cape, and parts of the Western Cape are still in this drought at the moment, actually in the Karoo, and the city of Cape Town coming close to our day zero where our taps might have run dry, which is, quite something if you look at the world and our urban centers, and that kind of thing hasn't really happened in too many places. It has happened in places like Brazil as well. Um, And even the drought that we had in the Western Cape actually created, mental health issues. A lot of people were coming with mental health issues to medical practitioners around anxiety and even going through almost the 5 stages of grief. Like the whole of the city of Cape Town was actually going through the different stages of grief at different times. So yeah, it's interesting to see even how long-term events like this can also impact us in terms of our mental health. So this graphic is quite an iconic climate change graphic that we like to show, because what it shows is over time. So starting with the blue lines, that was kind of our well-known kind of average climates that we have been used to as human civilization. And we've designed all our infrastructure and the way that we live around that climatic envelope, essentially, wherever we live in the world. And where we are today is very close to a departure point, basically, in terms of if we don't reduce our emissions and get our house in order and actually change our economy and the way everything works off of fossil fuels, we will go on that top path, which turns into a purple, dark purple color. And that is quite a terrifying future that actually is not hospitable for humans and probably many species as well, probably entire ecosystems. So that is not the pathway that we want to go on. And the pathway we want to go on is to keep our global temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which means, I said earlier, that pivotal point that we have to hit our emissions trajectory going down to reach that is by 2030, which is just around the corner. So we have until 2030 basically to avert a global crisis. And this is all 100% backed by science, and there are, hundreds of thousands of scientists behind these reports. So it's not kind of anything that's being overblown or put out of proportion. It's a very real existential threat. So this is important because this is the context of the world that we're in, and the context that many people are finding themselves kind of either waking up to or starting to really realize what is going on, especially for younger generations who have also been, they're being educated about this in school environments and universities as well. So that is where we are. So I threw quite a few images at you, and I'm sure some of you might be thinking, oh God, this is really depressing. And like, how are you feeling right now? For me personally, I have faced those kinds of images, for the past 2 decades, and those kinds of forecasts of the future. And it has sent a lot of professionals like myself into quite negative headspaces, and have a lot of climate change practitioners are really needing a lot of mental health support. But this goes, way beyond even climate change practitioners now. So it's the mental health impacts of this kind of news and information is really starting to hit home to a lot of people. But I think what's important is also just in terms of our behavior as humans and how we process things, is a really great TED talk done by Piers Stockness. It's called How to Transform Apocalypse Fatigue into Action on Global Warming. It's amazing. You should check this out if you're interested in this topic. But basically, he also explains, why it is that maybe we're not all in a mental health kind of crisis. It's because we have these mechanisms to protect ourselves. So there's 5 inner defenses that can stop people from engaging from climate change, which is a problem. And I myself, even as a, very aware person, has faced some of these. So we can either distance ourselves, so that it's something that we think it's in the future, it's somewhere else, someone else is being impacted by it. And I think for a long time it was easy to do that. But, as we've seen, the climate change impacts are really starting to come close to home, to where everybody lives, in some way, in some manifestation. We can just hear this doom and gloom over and over. We've been hearing this news for years, decades even. And this is what he talks about in terms of apocalypse fatigue, is basically you kind of just switch it off. You can't, you disengage. And I think, we can draw a parallel to this with the COVID pandemic. We all were very engaged, maybe the first 6 months to a year, and eventually people just feel fatigue. You can't face the negative news anymore, and you actually just disengage. The third one is around dissonance, where we deal with guilt about our contribution, but we start rationalizing it. We say, okay, well, maybe I won't have children, then I can fly around the world. Or maybe maybe me going vegan will enable me to do this. So we start really just trying to rationalize our own behavior to make ourselves feel better about our own contribution to the world. We can go into denial, and what he says and talks about is, hello? Is there a problem with the sound?
No, continue.
Okay, I just heard a noise. All right.
That's
Carry
fine.
on.
We all hear.
So what he talks about is that denial is not really about ignorance, and we see this. I think you probably see this in the health sector too. People can go into denial about different health aspects that are happening to themselves. It's not that they're ignorant. It's a defense mechanism. It's a defense mechanism that we can put up. And then the last one is around identity. So we all have certain value systems and identities that we've formed in the world. And it could be, a classic example is probably from the US, where we have a very certain paradigm about conservatives and liberals. And you could think, well, climate change means that I won't be able to drive in a car, or I won't be able to do travel, and those kind of go against your identity as seeing the world as one where we should be able to have freedom to do whatever it is that we want. So all of these different defense mechanisms can be kicked up. And I think that's important, even just to check ourselves and think, okay, this is maybe what's happening to me or others around me. And a lot of people are in these different phases around climate change. So it's also why there's been a lot of challenges around actually trying to tackle climate change globally, because all of these behaviors are basically going on within individuals and societies as well. So I think, what is important when we're thinking about climate change is that this pain for the world and our kind of society that a lot of people are feeling is actually a normal, healthy response to a world that is in trauma. It's not a response to something that's not out there. It really is a response to an unfolding disaster. So just to now just delve a little bit into what climate change means for the health sector in general. I think quite a few of you are kind of working in the space already, but there's a variety of impacts from the different pathways. It can be from heat and heat waves. I mentioned Canada a little bit earlier in the discussion. It can be through our water contamination, which is also, the temperature of the water is also warming along with having other pollutants in our waterways, so causing diseases through that pathway. It can be changes in vectors and viruses. We don't know, for example, to what extent climate change could have had a role in the start of this pandemic. We do know that environmental degradation is definitely opening up pathways to release more viruses and vectors from wild and natural spaces where humans maybe weren't in as close contact before. Increasing allergens is something interesting. There is some evidence to say that this is happening in South Africa already. Increasing pollen levels, causing increasing allergies, even I think around Cape Town as well. And then other impacts, on our food supplies and malnutrition. Um, Physically, in terms of our human health as well, there are impacts on cardiovascular disease, blood pressure, and those are going to become concerning on top of an already high existing load of those kinds of diseases as well. This is just another slide that shows the same thing. There's a few slides that I might not go into too much detail, and there's a few that are hidden as well, but I will send this all through to be shared. So this also just talks a little bit to, the impacts in terms of gender and age are also very nuanced as well. And that's particularly important when it comes to quite a few of the aspects around climate change and health. And then in terms of mental health, this is impacting people at an individual level, like I've started to talk about the eco-anxiety aspects, but it's also at a community level in terms of increasing, potential violence and aggression, which can happen with heat. It's a known result of heat. Even if you think about yourself, I get more irritable when it's very hot. I do not like hot weather, and it makes me very grumpy. So imagine now all of us are getting like that. It can have a societal impact. Yeah, and then just in terms of how people are responding to the mental health overload that's starting to happen, we know that a lot of people will reach out to substances, and it will also create strains on social relationships and so on. So yeah, so now it's just starting to delve into the mental health crisis. I'm sure that, many of you are seeing this mental health crisis that's happening in the world in general. We have rising numbers of depression, anxiety, and also particularly in younger generations. And we've also seen a complete overload in terms of what's been happening with the pandemic in the last year and the response to that directly and indirectly, as there's multiple strains on people, on families in terms of job losses and economic stress. So we already have a mental health crisis that is quite significant and growing. And I know that in the last year alone, our Western Cape government, services have said, they're just overloaded and so many people are in need of help. So climate change on top of that is just going to exacerbate a lot of this, which is concerning, given the kind of resources that we do have available in places like South Africa. Just a little bit of a look at the data. I mean, I've been talking in general. What do we know about, how many people are actually worried about climate change? Is it just, a few people like me? It's not. It's really a lot. So there have been some studies done in various countries. There's one done in the UK. Over 70% of 18 to 24-year-olds are worried about climate change. Many teachers are unable to teach about the subject. They're not equipped. Very few youngsters also know what to do about solving the climate crisis. And over half of child psychiatrists surveyed in England said that patients have environmental anxiety, so helplessness, anger, insomnia, panic, and guilt. And that's quite something. That's very worrying. And yeah, it's definitely pointing at some trends that are happening. Similar kinds of things are being found in New Zealand and Australia. 1 in 3 people in New Zealand are worried about climate change. 50% are very or extremely concerned. 79% of adults in Australia are concerned about the destruction of native wildlife, and this may have also resulted from those horrific fires that they faced in 2020. 59% of young people believe climate change is a significant threat to their safety. So fundamentally, young people are worried about their safety. And we know that feeling secure about your safety is really one of the most basic kind of nets that we need. So we need access to food, access to water, access to energy, and we need to feel safe. So this is impacting young people particularly, but it is also impacting, all generations, but probably more significantly so millennials and Gen Z. The mental health community globally is starting to become very concerned, and there are movements happening. There's the Climate Psychology Alliance that's developed, and the Climate Psychiatry Alliance that have emerged. So these are groups of practitioners that are sharing knowledge, they're working together, they're trying to provide lists of climate-aware practitioners that individuals can reach out to and know that they will be reaching out to someone who understands the problem, that knows that what we're facing is a real threat. And in South Africa, the Psychology Society of South Africa has formulated the Climate, Environment and Psychology Group, which I'll talk a little bit more about later as well. So it's an emerging area of interest in South Africa too. There's loads of literature emerging. It's like an exploding area of literature. I can't even vaguely keep up. There's numerous books and a lot of academic papers being put out. So there's some nice examples here. And even sort of personal stories as well around, people in Australia and the US and other areas who faced recent disasters and how they are processing, and also trying to explain potentially to their children, what it is that's going on and how we can work through these emotions around it. So what is eco-anxiety? I mean, I've mentioned it a couple of times. Eco-anxiety is a feeling of worry, nervousness, unease, triggered by an awareness of the ecological threats facing the Earth due to climate change. And it can manifest in worry, rumination, generalized anxiety, insomnia, panic attacks, sadness, loss, guilt, hopelessness, and irritability. So a lot of these are symptoms of anxiety and depression that, we may be familiar with, but they're manifesting for a different reason to maybe what kinds of anxiety and depression many of us may have faced or are facing. And there's a lot of different terms as well that kind of all fall under eco-anxiety. There's eco-grief, there's climate grief, there's eco-paralysis, solastalgia. So there's a lot of different kind of aspects of it that are coming out. And so the definition suggests that it's not a response to an acute event, but it's really a state of mind that arises gradually as we watch, what's happening in terms of climate change unfolding. This young lady, Clover Hogan, she started a sort of an international movement, and she's did a TEDx talk as well. She said, environmental disaster is the biggest mental health issue of our lifetimes. And in our war against nature, young minds are the collateral damage. So they have a big movement trying to really support particularly young people in dealing with the mental health aspects of climate change. But I think this quote is quite important. It says, if eco-anxiety is treated as a pathology, then the forces of denial will have won. So basically, he's saying that we are witnessing, what we're witnessing isn't a tsunami of mental illness per se, but it's actually a long overdue outbreak of sanity. And I think this is what's important, is that this is something that everyone needs to work through. Basically, we need to feel the emotions and work through it and come to a point of being able to take action. So that's a great quote there. And then I just picked out, this as a recent article written by a group of medical practitioners in the US, just saying that the climate emergency calls for a new approach to mental health. So I picked out one or two quotes from that article. It says, to build population level or universal capacity for mental wellness and resilience with respect to the impacts of the climate emergency, This requires our mental health system to more actively engage community members in preventing large-scale traumas and in healing from them when they do occur. But also, it's necessary to avoid the devastating mental health and psychosocial problems that climate change will engender. And then, this is obviously in the US, but time is of the essence to prepare every American resident for the protracted mega emergencies speeding our way. If we remain ill-equipped, the resulting individual and collective traumas will threaten everyone's health, safety, and well-being. But also, importantly, what they say is that it will make it all but impossible to enact the changes required to actually reduce our emissions and reduce temperatures to manageable levels. So basically, like, what they're saying is that we need to take action now around mental health, because if we don't, we're basically going to face a tsunami of these impacts on people's mental health, which will then basically stop people from being able to take, rational action and actually, sort out what we need to sort out, which I think is quite something coming from the US. So how do we really deal with these issues? So the key to coping with eco-anxiety is to build psychological resilience, which sounds very obvious, but most people do not have psychological resilience. Many people are not coping with what's happening in the world, even without putting climate change on top of that. To say that climate change is happening right now and it's affecting people all over the world. So it's very important that we actually acknowledge this and say it and understand it and work with it, particularly in the health sector, to understand that people coming to medical practitioners may be having these feelings and it may be impacting them. And we all need to find a way to be with the difficult emotions and to process them, which is what I just said that in the previous slide. So there's 3 key strategies. So the first is unhooking from the worry loop. And, that can be different strategies for different people. Some people are really, maybe ruminating, reading articles, doom scrolling, as we, I can't believe that's actually a term these days, but a lot of us do that. So trying to find behavioral strategies to kind of stop doing that, but really importantly, connecting with others. And of course, this has become incredibly difficult in the last year and a half under the COVID scenario, but there are ways of doing this, and supporting people to be able to do that. And then engaging personal agency. So moving into a space of being able to take action and not kind of get sunk right down into the depths of despair. So there are a lot of novel approaches out there, how, in terms of how different groups are trying to tackle the problems. I mentioned the Psychology and Psychiatry Alliances that have emerged, and the Psychology Society for South Africa, the group that they're forming there. I think if anyone from UCT is wanting to engage the space, this would be, the perfect place to kind of connect and start seeing what research is required in South Africa. Do we know enough about this in South Africa? I think at the moment the answer is we don't know a lot, and it's very early stages to really be trying to engage on what the trends are in South Africa as well. There's an organization called the International Transformational Resilience Coalition. So that's also a group of psychologists and climate change practitioners. So it's almost like a nexus of different practitioners trying to work together to unpack things. And then actually, actual kind of practitioners who are really supporting people at the moment are groups like there's climate cafes that you can join. I personally actually facilitate for the Good Grief Network, which is based out of America, but it's an international network. So they do a 10-step process, which is a peer-to-peer group support process of helping people to move through these emotions. I'll talk a bit more about that just now. Spiritual-based interventions. There's something called the Work That We Connect. A lot of activity there. There are also kind of these group spaces that you can go into and get support on the issue. And then there's, a lot of growing online resources and forums. And then there's also coaches like myself who are starting to work in the space and support individuals. The Good Grief Network, I just thought I'd share it as a novel kind of approach to working on something like eco-anxiety and climate grief. It's a space where you can actually go and work through. It's almost like a Alcoholics Anonymous. It's a step-by-step process, and it's a very safe space where you're able to talk if you want to. You don't even have to, and also to just hear what others are going through without providing any advice necessarily, but really just being in a place where you can hold space for each other. And it works through, accepting the severity of the problem, understanding how to live with uncertainty, which is something that many of us really, really grapple with. It's really difficult to live with uncertainty. If you just think about the COVID pandemic and the uncertainty of where is it going? How many more variants will there be? Will the vaccines work for all of them? If you start thinking about all of those different scenarios, it's very challenging to live with that and find peace with, what's going on. And the same goes for climate change. So yeah, you can see it's quite an interesting process. And it ends with trying to really bring people through to take meaningful action in whatever way is possible for an individual. Some people are really in a space where they can't do much and they just need to hunker down and grow a garden at home, and then others are able to really take, action at a level where they can go back to being activists. There's a real range of outcomes for people. So just a bit more on what you can do and how you can, or you can support others in working through eco-anxiety. So what's really important is knowledge, is understanding the relationship between mental health and climate change. And I think we have a lot to do on that. Understanding how it can impact patients and societal health, observing how external influences impact your mindset. And I think working with individuals, patients, that can also be really important. A single event can trigger something for people and really trigger some trauma, and trying to help people to be able to work through that could be important as well. And realizing the impact of your self-limiting beliefs. In terms of skills that we need to also either build ourselves or support others in, is verbalizing how we feel, and being able to do that in safe spaces, and understanding our belief systems, our value systems, and how they can serve or be a disservice to us in terms of our response to climate change. Developing resilience to external factors. I think many of us have had to practice developing these resilience skills in the last year and a half. And, how can we support others in developing that kind of resilience? In terms of behavior, just, there's a lot that can be done in terms of rewiring our own beliefs through action, acting on, our new skills or talents that we already have. Everybody's way of responding to climate change doesn't have to be the same. I think there's a lot of people that get anxiety thinking about the challenge of climate change, of environmental degradation, thinking that they have to do everything and they have to do it perfectly. And so eco-anxiety can also arise from just how much we might need to do to respond. But a lot of people are saying we don't need to do things perfectly. We don't need 7 billion people doing things perfectly, but we do need 7 billion people just trying. So doing whatever it is that is in your ability to do, and using spheres of influence to inspire action in others. Yeah, and then this final message, I think really from me, is that the voices have changed. There's been many voices over the past 2-3 decades around climate change, but ultimately what we need is hope. And there is hope. There's time to change what we're doing. And there is time for us to reimagine a better future, not one that is full of doom and gloom. But the theory is simple. We cannot run from our feelings any more than we can run from the climate crisis. So I think that's my take-home message. And yeah, I think that's just how you can contact me. But maybe there's some discussion around, maybe it's just brought up some thoughts around, well, what do we know in South Africa? What might we do in South Africa that's different? Are there spaces for research? Yeah, so I'll open up to see if there are any questions or discussion points that maybe James wants to lead us in. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for a very clear, stimulating exposition of the challenges. I'm getting an echo. Sorry. Can you just mute there?
Oh, I'll mute my side. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, so just to say thank you for a very clear exposition of, the mental health impacts of climate change and some of the responses from around the world and some of the principles for managing our own responses and stimulating thoughts around the kind of knowledge, skills, and behavior that we can be taking on ourselves, and also helping our students as educators to take on as well. So the floor is open for any questions or of your own or in response to what you've heard. Thank you. If you could just raise your hand if you have a question. Okay, perhaps I'll just kick off to say, so have you worked with academics and educational institutions before? And if you have, what are some of the lessons that you can share with us from that work?
James, I haven't worked specifically on sort of topic around mental health and eco-anxiety with academics yet. But there is a lot of interest sort of internationally. So there's a lot of different groups that are doing work in the space. There's also, quite a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists that are engaging in the space and starting to want to develop sort of research areas. I know in South Africa, that's why I did mention the Psychology Society for South Africa. So I think that would be a good space to start kind of networking and engaging as well, if there are folks who are interested. Yeah, so that's my answer.
Okay, Psychology Society. And I see they're the ones that are initiating a climate and environment group. I think
so they wanted to become a full division of the society. So it's basically you don't have to be a psychologist to join. You can be kind of anyone who's interested in that space. So it's open to a broader network of, I think, allied health professionals.
Okay, thank you. So I see questions firstly from Hannah, and then from Panyo, and then Insiki. So Hannah, if you could unmute yourself.
Yeah,
thank
hi.
you.
Hi, I don't have a question, but I just wanted to first say thank you so much for this talk. I have never heard of eco-anxiety before this, and it's really put a name to something that I and people that I know have been experiencing. So it was very interesting to have it described like this. And I was quite happy to hear about how you're not describing eco-anxiety as an abnormal response. It's actually, there was that quote I really loved, something about it's a sane response. And I think usually we think of anxiety and depression and those kind of disorders as abnormal response, whereas eco-anxiety is, very rational, really, when you consider the state that our world is in. So, yeah, I just wanted to comment on that.
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's often a comment I hear is that it's a new term, really, and that a lot of people didn't realize that there was a term that described potentially how they're feeling or others that they know are feeling. Yeah.
Panyo, your question, please.
Hello. Yes. Thank you so much for the presentation. I just wanted to ask, especially in the context of the United States, where there's a lot of derision of people who are uh, sounding the alarm bell, how would you actually confront someone who said this is not actually a real thing, eco-anxiety? I mean, as you said, it's not a pathology, but they may say, well, it's actually because it's a spurious thing. Um, and as you see, I don't know if you're following in the US, but they've really derided Greta Thunberg and people who are really taking to task the big climate polluters of the world. So how would you back that up to those people who would seek to deride what you've just presented? Thank you.
Thanks, Nsiki. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And I think that one slide that I put up that had the 5 Ds around denial, dissonance, etc., really talk to that. Particularly in places like the US, there's certain value systems that people have grown up with and worldviews that have been nurtured. And if climate change is seen as something that is going to threaten your worldview, it's almost like the response is that you are not wanting to see your culture kind of die, essentially. And that is kind of it's a way of protecting yourself, your culture. So what's important is just trying to take a step back and understand where people are coming from and what it is that they value in the world. And if you can understand what they value in the world, then you can try and then create that thread around climate change and what it means in terms of what they value. So, trying to hit them with the stick of saying, the science says this is the way it is not going to help. And we see that with health related things as well, with vaccines, etc. It's a tricky one. So it's a good question, but really trying to kind of sit down and really understand where others are coming from is at the heart of it. Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. So that was Panyo's question. Nsiki is next. Okay.
Thanks, Sarah. So I was just going to say that I think the research is perhaps something that we need to catch up on. But if one is looking at experiences, especially in the rural areas, I mean, I can speak for the area that I come from. There's been a lot of the eco-anxiety and I suppose also depression related to that. Because people are still relying on farming, for their livelihood and sustenance. And I remember it's probably over 10 years now where my mother told me that they had black rain. And I mean, it was a unique experience. And I think for days, that's all they spoke about amongst themselves. Because it was not something that they have ever experienced. And I remember that I was at Vets then, so I established contact with a colleague at CSIR, and I asked them if this is something that they would look at, and also wondering what would be the implications of that, long term. And subsequently, I mean, what has happened in the Eastern Cape is that there have been months where there's been no rain. To the point where, people have had to buy water. And the one discussion that we had amongst ourselves was that the next war is going to be about, it would be war about water. And so if one then were to go back and look at the experiences of the people who reside in those communities, I think, I mean, there might be a lot, in terms of data that could be sourced in terms of the experiences over a period, and I'm saying 10 years and maybe beyond that, because there's been a lot of that. And I mean, the way it manifests is is variable depending on the area in which you come from. But I mean, this one incident was a significant incident for those communities. And I think since then, there's been other incidents that relate to climate change. And I mean, I'm saying this because growing up, farming and also climate changes were interrelated. You knew that, you know, at a certain point, you had to farm the fields, you had to, you know, do this, that, and the other. And so the changes, although they're not pronounced from a South African perspective, they probably are changes that I mean, have a place and resonate, you know, with the communities that live in those areas.
Thanks, Nsiki.
Thank you, Nsiki. Yeah, that's it's yeah, that's a really amazing story that you've shared. Yeah, you know, I also wonder, so the eco-anxiety kind of terminology and language and issues around all of that have really mostly arisen in kind of Western countries. And I do wonder, you know, there has been some discussion if it is something that's more for privileged people and communities. So there's been some discussions about that internationally. And I'm wondering if, you know, maybe eco-anxiety has been around for, you know, decades, maybe centuries. We've just never been able to label it and understand, yeah, maybe kind of group it into some kind of understanding. It's all around environmental loss, and environmental loss has been a much more acute thing in rural areas and farming areas where people are, you know, closely intertwined with the natural environment. And so I think maybe for people in urban environments who are really just, it's kind of starting to dawn on them, like what's happening to the world. It's becoming like this bigger issue. Yeah, it's just a thought that came up after that story.
Yeah. Carla, good morning.
Good morning. Hi, thank you so much, Sarah, for your talk. Really appreciated that. I just to make a comment about a point you raised and then to ask a question. I mean, I think you're right. And this particular framing of concerns around environmental change and climate have been named, you know, eco-anxiety, but certainly, you know, the work of people like Vandana Shiva and other eco-feminists over the last 20, 30 years have shown, you know, the impacts directly on the ground, particularly amongst women responsible for food growing and, you know, sustaining. So I think there is a lot of knowledge available that is outside of the kind of ordinary disciplinary realms that you know, we often, you know, look for knowledge in. And so you know, the movement more recently towards looking at Indigenous knowledge systems and, you know, community-based knowledge systems, I think is going to be very helpful. In terms of eco-anxiety and grief, I suppose the question I had is, so you know, obviously on one hand there is the need for healthcare professionals and practitioners to support individuals through the grieving, through the anxieties, through the processes. But creating resilience in a context where there's systemic and structural issues that are at fault means that, you know, we can fix individuals, but if we're not fixing systems, are we just making people better able to cope in a collapsing world? So I suppose my question is, how do you find, like you personally in your coaching experiences, how do you find the balance between the support that people need to work through the mental health challenges and, you know, the realizations that the climate crisis, while we have individual responsibilities, you know, to try and mitigate it, is perpetuated by structural systems, including neoliberalism and the capitalist scene. So I just, like, what advice would you give to healthcare practitioners in relation to that, finding that balance between supporting the individual and kind of linking that to the structural concerns? Thanks.
Thanks, Carla. Yeah, those are great comments. And yeah, I think there's a lot that we should be looking to in terms of Indigenous knowledge systems and kind of more on the ground voices. I think in terms of your question around, yeah, in terms of dealing with the structural change that is required versus our own individual kind of response to the world, one of my comments earlier was that, people need to be able to do what they can do. So some of us can actually be delving into trying to take down and deal with those structural changes that are required and systems that are required, but obviously not everybody is able to or capacitated to do that. So it is a delicate balance, and it's going to depend on the individuals in question. So for some people, it is really adapting to a world that is changing around us and being okay with it and coming to peace with it. Okay, so we all actually need to do that. But, for some people, it's really just about that. And then for others, that can also empower them to really fully engage in structural change processes. So like I did say earlier, there is this window of opportunity. There is still time to make a significant change in the world. Even if we do get that all right by 2030 and the 2 decades after that, there will be change in the world. So we do all have to adapt in different ways, and our society has to. So yeah, there's a lot that needs to be done. And I think anyone who has like voices of power or who's able to also network and kind of collaborate and bring large numbers of people with them to continually take the messages to government, to large corporations, etc., that the change has to be made now. If people are able to do that, then to try and to empower them to be able to do that is really critical. So to raise their agency so that they can engage in that.
Sarah, thank you so much. Just in the last few minutes, just to say in the chat, Amber Abrams of Future Water Institute has spoken about medical anthro research around anxiety after impacts of extreme weather, and a review protocol is currently registered on that topic. And then Andrea has asked about how eco-anxiety is felt and addressed within different socioeconomic communities. And I think Nsiki's comment also sort of, and Carla's really got me thinking about how, indigenous peoples have for centuries been dispossessed, and this relationship with the land has been severed, and the kind of pain that they have experienced is now a universal pain. The solastalgia is the term that's been given, and so in dealing with that pain, we've seen indigenous communities crumble, but we've also seen others stand up and be resilient. And it strikes me that there's a lot to be learnt from those that have been resilient and standing up in defense of their land, as we're currently seeing. So I think this is something that a topic that will certainly grow in importance, and we wish you well with your work, and we look forward to further engagement around this with you and with others. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for your contributions and the discussion, and see you next time.
Thanks, James. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.